Ani Bojo, Segogwego, Sewaris. This is Lindsey Lickers, the Indigenous Anti-Human Trafficking Development Coordinator here, and welcome to our additional wellness bundle video for watercolor. I was asked to show a bit of how to use watercolors, some 101, and kind of just a few techniques to get you started. We are unveiling our new coloring book that would have came out in your bundles, but we also had the idea to provide an extra layer of activity for those of you who want to learn and dive a bit deeper into arts practice, art therapy, whatever reason you want to do this for, even if it's just a fun hobby. So we wanted to provide this opportunity for you. And yeah, so we're going to get started. So firstly, one of the things that is the best course of action when we're starting to, getting ready to sit down and paint is always to make sure that you have all of the things that you're going to need ready to go. So you'll see here that I have the image that's been transferred onto some really nice thick watercolor paper. I don't have normally if I was doing this on a different table, I would put down something to kind of protect it. But I'm in my art studio and it's meant to have paint and different things on it. It's got glue on it. So for me, it's not really a big deal. But for you, you might want to think about maybe putting down some paper, paper towel, or if you want, maybe some newsprint, newspaper, something like that, just to protect your surfaces, right? And what you'll also need to do is prepare your watercolors. So in your kits, you may have gotten a different kind of watercolor. Here I have tubes. This brand is called Cotman, and it comes in these little tubes. They might seem small, but the thing to understand about watercolors is that watercolors they spread with water, right? Water is a big proponent of making these work for you and achieving different effects. So this little tube actually can go quite a bit of distance once you start to add water to it. So that's why they look so cute and tiny. I got a pretty simple pack here. For me, myself, I have an art background, so I'm pretty confident in mixing colors. There are other types of sets that you can get out there that are much more complicated, have so many different colors, so you can avoid mixing. Especially also, it cuts down on time, right? Some people really want to have enough time to be able to, do their whole thing and not have to worry about that. I also have here a little mini palette, and I bought this at Michael's. You can choose to get one of these if you like. I pretend to like them because if I want to leave these can dry up, and that's the beauty part as well about watercolors is you can let the pigments dry, and because they get activated with water, you can just pick up where you left off. For using other paints like acrylics, I will use a palette like this. Actually, I use a bigger, it's called a butcher tray, and they use it at the butchers. But I like to put all my paints in there, and then that way I can cover it so that I can keep my acrylic paints moist for a long period of time so they don't dry out. But you don't have to worry about that with watercolor. But if you are looking to explore in the future, that might be something that you might want to invest in and look into. But otherwise, a regular glass plate will work. What's nice about these is that they're sectioned off so that if you have different mixes, like you can kind of see here that I'm going to do, it keeps them from spreading into each other, because once you activate it, the water will tend to make it really spread. So keeping that in mind, whatever is what you feel the most comfortable with. Some people like to get little baby food jars or like little caps or whatever. Whatever you really find around the house. Anything can really work as long as it's not a surface that it can get absorbed into, similar to the paper, right? So I have that off to the side. I also prepared with a jar. You can see my nice fancy painting jar. I've been using this jar for quite a bit of time. But that's to hold your water. And again, watercolor really important. Any kind of painting practice, it's important to have water. Not just because you working with watercolors, that's how you mainly activate things. You activate the pigments, but you also want to make sure that you're keeping your brushes clean, because throughout the process, unless you're going for a very muddied look, things will kind of get together, and when you start to rinse off in the water in between colors, some of the color will do transference. So that's why it's always good to keep cleaning your water as well. So when you see your water get dirty, it gets murky, then you can change it, right? But that's after a few cycles of washing your brush off. And then I know some watercolor practitioners, some painters actually prefer to have separate water containers for, up to 4 different kinds of colors. So it's really up to you how you want to do that. But some kind of vessel that can keep your water in, for you to rinse off is really important. I also have some paper towel nearby. That is to, again, wipe off some of the color. This also comes into play when you're doing dry brushing techniques, which I'll try to show you a little bit here and there. But yeah, so we always have some paper towel beside us. And then lastly is our brushes. So there's all different kinds of paint brushes, but there's always going to be specialized brushes for different kinds of paint mediums. So for watercolor, there's a specialized kind of brush. You can see here, these are brand new brushes, so they're a bit stiff yet. So when I first get a brush pack, I just kind of, move it around with my hand, get those natural oils in there, to break it apart and kind of get it flexible again. So getting it prepared to paint, because you don't want to kind of go into this without knowing, how your brush is moving. You don't want to dip it into your paint, and then if you haven't broken it up and made it a little bit more relaxed, the bristles, then it can kind of cause some weird effects for you. And they come in all different kinds of sizes. Most watercolor sets will give you a good variety. As you can see here, there is kind of like a round brush, a square brush, and then a detail brush. And there'll be different varying sizes of all of that, right? So you can see this here. And again, I just got these from Michael's, right? Nothing too fancy. As you get further, if this has become something that you really want to concentrate on, I know a lot of artists will, eventually do a trial and error with all of the different kinds of brushes that are out there. And most of us will find, certain brands that would kind of become brand loyal and, work the best for our practice. And that's the great thing about art, is that there's so many different things out there, so many different tools that you can use, and you can become quite proficient in using. It's just really all about preference. But the main piece to understand here, what you want to kind of aim for, is that we want to have, we want to have a nice variety of sizes, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to get into the painting. So as you see here, I already kind of mapped out. I took a look at the image, right? And the image is, one of the designs from our coloring book was done by Angela Jason. And thank you, Miigwech, so much for from them allowing us to do this for this demo. Use the image. It's a really beautiful image. It's a very fluid image. And what I'm kind of seeing is that connection to water, land, right? The stories. So what I kind of opted for was looking at the animal colors, starting to map out what kind of colors I wanted to use, and then also the colors of, the water. And then I have, I'm going to bring in some of the greens for the earth. But, again, I don't know if I'm going to get finished this in this session, but this is more just for me to show you techniques, right, to get you started. So you want to kind of look at your composition and say, hey, what are the main colors that I want to focus on, right? What is the main thing I want to focus on first? And the other part to understand too is there's not really a wrong way to, start a watercolor painting. Some people will say it's easier to layer on top of each other light to dark. But that's also depending on, the kind of effect you want to make. Some people like to layer on dark to light, right? It just really depends. And then also we'll go into a few different ways that you can actually use the watercolors themselves. So you have to really think about, what do you want to focus on first? Do you want to focus on the background and then go in with details over top? So like in this composition, you might want to focus on the background of these back layers and then go in and focus on these guys, right? Like on in the more detail. So it's really up to you how you see. I personally feel like I want to do kind of like a flowy, a real authentic watercolor technique, when you kind of see the colors bleeding into each other. So in order to achieve that, there's a few things that I can do. I can take this and get these really, really watery and then apply them that way. The other way that I'm probably going to do here is something called a wet method. So a wet method is where you start off with an entirely wet surface and go in with colors here and there. But the ideal part of this is, in order for that to work, is most of the areas of where you want to have that watery kind of spread out color has to be wet, right? Not drenched, not soaking wet, but wet enough. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to concentrate on just a few spots. So I got my brush nice and wet, right? There we go. And it's not dripping. See how it's not dripping? It's wet enough where it's not going all over the place. But I'm going to go over here and just go nicely over and get it nice and shiny. You'll see what I'm talking about as you're doing it. And now I have to be a bit careful because the color, not the color, but the outline, I had to outline this myself. You will have a pre-printed copy. So I had to actually, what I did this outline in is I made sure to do it in an oil Sharpie. So that as an oil Sharpie, it really helps the outlines to not go crazy, like not bleed, because the paper is meant to catch, that bleeding effect and kind of soak into the area a bit. Okay. So you can see I'm just kind of putting a nice layer on top of there. Okay. Just focusing, pulling that water around. Okay. So now it's important to do the wet and have as clean water as possible. That really makes it the easiest way to do that effect. So I want to take some blue, get some watercolor going here. And really, less is more in most cases. It's easier to build up less at first and then more as you're going. It's harder to go backwards from that point. So now we're going to have a little bit of that watercolor on there. And I'm just going to start down here and look at what happens. You can see how that is already starting to spread a bit. I'm going to come in a bit closer so you can kind of see. So you can see what's happening here is if I go like this on both sides of that line, you can see that that's spreading out, right? It's got that nice water, the quintessential watercolor effect, right? And I'm just going gently, right? Just a little bit above, not hard, I'm not pressing really hard. I'm just kind of feathering the paintbrush and pulling out the color, pulling the color from the middle. You see? Because I really want to have that kind of watery, dreamy kind of color effect, right? And I pull that way up here, pull that. And you'll notice that the less pigmentation that's on your brush, the more translucent it will be. That's really how you build up color in watercolors, is you just keep adding a little bit at a time. So I'm pulling up, pulling up, pulling up. Another thing you can do as well is like you can keep adding water as you're going, right? Because there is pigmentation still on this brush. So I can use that to my advantage. So I just got this really wet. Okay. And then I'm going to go, right? So I'm just kind of patting it. Pat, 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 pat. So there you can kind of see some of the darker spots sitting on top of there. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just show you what happens when I take a bit more of the pigmentation. So you can see on here that it's really coated, right? Get a little bit more actually, so that you can see. So there's more in there, right? And now I'm going to take that and go right in the middle here. Ooh, see that? That's really what you want to do. Again, I've always found it's easiest to build up from light to dark, right? But again, it depends on what kind of technique you want to achieve. What do you want it to look like? And I'm hoping that they've sent a couple different designs and watercolor sheets. You can also decide too, if you want, when you're going to get supplies, you could also grab and pick up there's most art stores sell like watercolor sheets and pads. So I'll just show you really quick. So this is a watercolor pad, and I go with 140 pound just as a standard. That's more of like art quality, right? It's thicker, it can hold more paint without, you can see how this paper is kind of rippling a little bit when it gets wet. The higher the pound, the sturdier it is to take the medium. And also you could do mixed medium pieces too, but we're not going there today, but that is something that you could do in the future and take a look into. So yeah, so here we go. You can kind of see how I'm creating this, that effect there, and just trying to add a few more spots. And if things are starting to get dry, I'm noticing that it's not spreading very well. What I do is I just grab more water and I just put the water down and spread that out. There we go. And if you want that whole section to have that kind of faded color, you just pull that color right across like that and meet it with the other part. There we go. Pretty, huh? So I'm going to continue doing that for a little bit. And I wanted to also show you a little bit of, so say you wanted to have a darker outline. So when you're doing outlines, what you're going to want to make sure of is that the paper is on its way to drying, right? So you can see that it's really wet on this side. It's moist over here, but it's not too bad. So what I'm going to do is just show you what it looks like when you add, just like a line. So you want to do like a nice outline like that. What you want to make sure is there's a consistency of the amount of pigmentation on your brush all the way down, right? So I'm going to do it on both sides here. And don't worry if it doesn't come out uniform the first try, because like I've been saying, the nice thing about watercolors is you can build the color up, right? You can even allow this whole page to dry, go, have a snack, and then come back and it's dry again. But all you need to do is get it wet again. And then it will do this exact same thing again. So you can kind of see that's kind of taking that color and creating a bit of an outline, right? So you can do it in a few different ways. And if I move up to here, I'll show you what happens when, I'm going to turn this, just flip this around. I'm going to show you what happens when you encounter a spot, or if you start with it being dry first. So this is a bit of this one's a bit of a detailed spot, right? It's a bit small. So I still always get my brush wet. Don't mind my squeaky chair. It's an antique chair, so it's seen some days. Got it at a flea market. So I'm looking at this color and I'm thinking I want to just start with just a straight up brown. So I get my brush coated, right? And I'm going to go blocking. I'm going to block it in. So what I want to do is I want to create kind of like an effect where it's more dense in the middle of these sections and then kind of fades out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a little bit of a thick spot in the middle. And what I mean by thick is like the most pigmentation, right? Like straight up just applying the paint directly to it. And similar over here. Okay. Similar over here. And I don't know about you, but it's been a while for me since I've done watercolors. I actually haven't done it since I was in university when I went to school for art. It's actually really meditative. It's calming. Okay. So now you have those kind of thicker blocks, right, of color. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to get my, wipe a little bit off of that, rinse it with my water, pat it to dry a bit with the paper towel, and then get my brush, adequately wet. And now I'm going to go in and start moving it around from the outside. A little bit closer for you. Okay. So you can kind of see how the pigmentation is staying really, opaque in the middle and starting to get more faded as you move out. Now I'm going to move over. So I didn't go right to the edge, right? I didn't go right to the edge because what I want that to do is I want that to dry a little bit. And then I'm going to go back in and get that surrounding area wet again, but not the middle. So that kind of builds the layers from the inside out. So same idea. Gonna get it wet around the middle. And basically what you're doing is you're building definition, you're building shadow in your composition. So it's going to give the illusion of like a 3D kind of effect to make it look like your animals are kind of popping out of the page a bit. Right? Even that itself is really nice. It's nice and pretty. Just generally, watercolor is one of those things that it's like a patience. It's a lot of patience, right? And I'm going to mix it up a little bit and I'm going to put in a whole color just to make it, a little bit interesting for the eye. So I'm going to go in and really lay it in thick because I'm going to fill this whole thing, right? So that's kind of looks ugly right now, but then again, that's the miracle of the water. You're going to go with the water and it's going to spread. There we go. See, just spread it nice and gentle. And I wouldn't worry about the lines too much because, with the lines, it's kind of like you can go back in after. You have, most kits, like most of the sets that are watercolor come with black, and you can go in and you can, go in with a black line and then, really beef up your lines if you do go over them and you don't like the look of it. The other thing you could do is you could also look into getting a paint marker. There's lots of acrylic paint markers, oil paint markers. As I said, I used an oil Sharpie when I did this. The nice thing about oil is, like I said, oil doesn't bleed really. Once it's fully dry, it doesn't bleed. It's like a permanent stays there thing. So that's a nice thing that I can, I use sometimes on these is to go over once my whole watercolor is done. I want it, it's where I want it. And then I'll go back in and do like a highlight or, make those lines really pop. I might even go into sometimes with a white, in addition to the black line, just to really make it pop, right? So I've left that. These are starting to dry a little bit, so I'm going to go around the edge with water and just nice and gently pull. The more you kind of blend, you can just keep blending it and it'll have that effect where, it's kind of like you're making that little circle, that line there disappear. Just pulling and adding water here and there, just around the edge, and then pulling it out. Okay. And then you can keep doing it on the other sides. So you can kind of see again, I'm kind of just tapping, just gently. I'm not putting a lot of pressure, right? And just pulling that color out from the middle. There we go. Tap, 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 tap. There we go. And then one more over on this side. That one's going to be a bit easier because it's still kind of a little wet. So you can kind of see when you let it dry fully, it gets a little bit harder. It's like you got to try and find that sweet spot of the drying process. So there we go. Okay. And I'm going to go in again. Some more thick paint. There we go. Let's keep going with full paint. That's basically got no water, like just very little water in it in my palette. And I'm just kind of pulling it and putting it there. Okay, now I'm going to go back in and add water. You can kind of see how easy it spreads out like that, right? And you can imagine if you added a lot of water to that, you're going to just go, it's going to go everywhere. So it's really the less is more, and it's a delicate process, right? Of just kind of trial and error and see what you like. So fill that one up. Okay. And if you're noticing in this process that you're like, hey, I really want that middle to be darker again. So all you need to do is just grab a little bit more on your brush and just go and add it in the middle, right? Just pat it, pat, 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 pat. Same thing again, if I want to add more in this little middle part, pat, 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 pat. Just let it sit there for a second. Same thing, can add a little bit more, make it a bit darker in the middle. You're really building layers, right? That's a lot of what painting's about, is, making layers. And one of the things they teach us in art school when we're, in the process, right? Because this isn't a finished piece, it's a process. When we're in process, we're told a lot to trust the ugly. So when it's not quite done, it's in that mid phase where it's like not done yet, but it's not, you didn't just start it. It's like that middle in between. It's hard because it looks, for us, we're like, oh, like that doesn't look good. But you have to really trust. It's a painting is really good for trusting your intuition. I actually didn't realize that until I was graduated and started doing ceremony and, started working on myself, doing my healing work, and then realizing, hey, actually, painting was one of the few places in my life that I always really, really trusted myself. And I had to because, you gotta just like commit, right? Sometimes. And that's how things kind of come out looking amazing when you really do commit, right? So trust the ugly. And I'm just going to do a nice little dark spot just up on this guy's head. Okay. Let that sit there for a bit. And what I really want to do too is I also want to kind of carry that blue, but I want it to be a bit darker. So what do? There's a darker blue here in the kit, at least in the one that I have. I don't know if there's one there, but usually there's a lighter blue, right? There's a lighter color or a darker color. There's just a couple variations. So if you're finding that your kit is really basic, you just need to do a little color mixing. So if it's possible, a lot of people think to make a color darker that they go automatically to black. Black is really powerful of a pigment. It will really wash out. It'll dominate a space. So you kind of, most artists, when we go to, you have a bit of like technical training, we actually don't use black as often as people would think you would. So what we actually use is a dark brown, a burnt sienna or an umber or something like that. And that's what we'll actually use to make the pigment darker. So that being said, I have this darker blue. I'm going to add some color or some water to it just to see what it looks like. Okay. So that's nice, but I want it a bit darker. So what I'm going to actually do is I'll show you. I'm going to take a brown. So this in my kit is a burnt sienna. Just put that over there for a second. I'm going to open it up. And I'm going to add just like the tiniest bit of brown. You'll see when I pull it back over here. So you see that? That's the brown. I only put like you can kind of see it better there. I only put a little bit because it's going to be powerful when I mix it together. It's better to go less before, instead of really putting in a lot of color. See, now you can see I just mixed that together and it made a darker blue. So it's a bit slightly darker than the kit came with, which is what I wanted. So it's really just about trial and error, right? And the nice thing about this is you can always use another, part of your tray and make a different mix, right? But if you find a color that you really like, it's good to also take a note of like how much you put in, because it's kind of like a recipe, right? It's like a formula. You want to make sure that you're keeping track of what it is you're doing. So I'm going to go in here while I'm waiting for that to dry a little bit because I really want that to stay, right? I don't want it to spread too much. So that's another thing you can do while you're doing this is you can also, move around your piece and really, start to, think about other spots while other parts are drying. So I want to make this a little bit wet. So again, remembering our wet technique. Okay. And I want to just make it wet around him because I want to make an effect of that spreading out as if he's splashing in water. Okay. Trying to be mindful not to go over the parts that I've already filled with more water, because what can happen is I'll drag that color into the rest of it, and that's not what I'm trying to do. If it happens, that's fine. You can always go over it with a bit more of the watercolor and build those layers up, but I'm trying not to do that. Okay, I think that's sufficiently wet now. Okay, now going back to this blue color. So now let's check it out. So again, just building. Build, put some more down here. Just building it up. Just kind of plopping some of the blue every now and then here and there. Oh, we got a big part there. Grab more water. And then just pull that water around. Just kind of squiggling. Again, remembering if I want to have this darker, I just simply pick up more pigmentation, right? More of the water, more of the paint with the water, and just kind of plot parts of that down, staying close to the lines. I'm trying to create just like an illusion of like a bit of a shadow, right? Just some light effects. There we go. I want it to be pretty dark in there. Add more. I'm gonna just pull some of that dark into this other blue. Nice. And I think I'm gonna even take some of that blue down here. Put it right here. See how that just made that so much darker? So say you do that, right? And you're like, oh no, that's not what I want. Basically, rule of thumb, just add, don't drench it, but just add more water on the edges and it'll disperse it, see? And then it'll look intentional. Watercolor is a lot about building, right? Building things up. So take some of that blue again, some of that darker blue. Yeah, kind of put that there. Just pull it into the rest of it. I'm probably going to let this spot dry a bit because it is a bit dark. I don't want it that dark. But if you keep going in when it's too wet, then it's just going to spread, and then you want to have things isolated a little bit, right? If that's the technique that you're going for. The other thing you can do is, like, if you don't want to do all of this little spotting, something that I do sometimes is, like, say if we look at the top here, right? Um, assuming this is sky, right? You can take your big brush. It's like this, right? And that's what we use to kind of coat the water. But you can do the same thing, right? You're going to get the whole part wet. And you can kind of see, you'll be able to see, like, if you look at a different angle of your paper, you'll be able to see if you've missed spots, just moving yourself around, and changing the direction of the, right? Changing the direction of the brush. Okay, so that whole top part is wet. I believe there's one more for good measure. Okay. All right, the whole top is wet now. Now, take the same brush, and I'm going to go in with this color that we were using towards the bottom, and I'm going to just drag it. So this is another technique you can do where you just want to fill. You want to have the whole thing filled, right? And if you want it to be uniform, you just pick up a bit more of the paint and you go back in. But that's something you can do for the entirety of it, right? If you wanted to start, you want to say, no, I want to do my background first, you can do it that way. It's really up to you. That's one thing that's really nice about watercolors is you can't really go wrong. And the only way you're going to figure out, like, what you like and what you want to do is by trying it. So there you go. That's the top. So now it's looking like it's coming together, right? And actually, I think it would be really beautiful to do even if I was to go in again. And because I'm using generally all the same colors, that makes it easier too, right? Because again, if you're using multiple colors, you kind of have to think a bit more about what you're doing, and what you're going to do first. And because a lot of times you don't want the colors to blend together. But if that's what you're trying to get at, like, even if you don't want to do the details, you might not want to do these details. You might just want to go, you know what? I just want to do, like, color, like the background, and have that be the main part of the watercolor, and then the line work to speak for itself, right? Because this is a beautiful design. This is a beautiful piece of art on its own. So sometimes people want to do that too, right? And that's totally okay. It's really up to you how you want to do it. This is a lot about, especially if this isn't what you do, right? Like, even me, I'm primarily an acrylic painter, and using aerosol and working huge. This is different for me because I don't do this very often. But it's really, like, I don't know, I'm having fun. I'm really remembering, like, oh, hey, I actually really liked watercolor at one point, you know? It's also pretty accessible for most people that can't afford to do, huge paintings and stuff, because it gets pricey. So I've made that all wet, right? So now I'm going to go in. I'm going to take that really nice blue color that we had. Get my watercolor all here. Get it saturated with water. And then I'm going to go, oh, look at that. That's got lots on there. Just going to take a little bit more off. There we go. Now watch what happens if I just pull this across. Right? It's really, like, I really love this medium because you really can do whatever you want. And because watercolor is the way that it is, I feel like you can't really mess it up. Like, it's going to look good regardless of what you do. But you can obviously be a bit more intentional of like what you're doing, like I was kind of showing you in the beginning. If I want to make more of a transition, have it not be such a sharp edge, I just fan it out and pull that color together. Right? Pull that color down. So now that spot's dried a bit more. So now I'm going to go back in with more water and just make that kind of bit easier of a transition, not so much of a hard line. So you can see what's happening is that line's disappearing as I'm kind of patting it with the brush, going in circles, pulling that pigment around. It's so nice, right? And I've got that one spot over here on this guy's head there. So now I'm going to go in with the water. Just kind of get it saturated and start pulling that color down. Ever cool, huh? So you can kind of see, the whole composition here. It's going to be wet for a while, so again, it's nice to have this set up somewhere where you can kind of just leave it. But yeah, so that's basically, watercolor 101. It's really about you exploring, right? And kind of trial and error and playing with the pigments. Yeah. So I'm really excited for, you to kind of take that journey, and if it's something that you want to start to pursue a bit more seriously, something you really fall in love with, that's amazing. If you don't, that's totally okay. Art is one of those things that's about finding what works the best for you and really what you enjoy doing, right? And there's so many different kinds of mediums and modalities that you'll definitely find something that will suit you, if that's something that you're interested in. So with that, I'll say miigwech, nyawa, goa, and thank you so much for joining me. And wow, look at that, time goes by. That's another thing with art. Time flies when you get in the zone, right? And you start creating. Um, but yeah, so I really look forward to your journey and wish you well in that. And I hope that this addition to the wellness bundles, helps bring some peace, some calm, or at the very least teaches some patience, gives you something to take away from it, right? So yeah, thank you so much.